Well, let's face it, you want the Nintendo Switch 2. Obviously, there's quite a big debate right now over whether or not it's worth it and really whether or not they should be charging so much for both the console itself as well as the games. But let's face it, if money was not an issue, yeah, the Switch 2 looks pretty cool. It kind of just builds off of what the Switch already is, and the games that are already announced, they look pretty cool. So anybody who wants to get it, obviously, go ahead and get it if you can afford it. But here's the thing, it's not actually going to be available to every single person on the planet, at least on launch day, for probably quite a while. You see, there is maybe not the best relationship that has been occurring between Nintendo and the country of China. I did kind of a deep dive, but maybe not too much of a deep dive to understand like all of the lore. I don't know how far back this rift between Nintendo and China actually goes. I don't know every little detail of it, but yeah, they don't exactly see eye to eye, at least in terms of allowing Nintendo just fully without any censorship into the country and its citizens. Yeah, you see, here's an interesting thing that I actually did not know until right now. The Nintendo Switch didn't come out in China for about 2.5 years after it was released worldwide in March of 2017. Yeah, in China, it was not released until December of 2019. Yeah, China definitely has a thing about censorship. When I look on Wikipedia, it says, as with almost all mass media in the country of China, video games in China are subject to the national policies of censorship. Content in video games is overseen by State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television, or National Radio and Television Administration. Yeah, that's what I found on Google that those acronyms stand for, and it says publishers are required to obtain a license for the game in China from SART before publishing, which may be denied if the game contains elements that are deemed inappropriate, and the process to submit games for a license and put them on sale following that is overseen by the Ministry of Commerce. So yeah, obviously China is very protective on basically what imports they allow in their country in terms of media, and obviously video games falls under that umbrella. You can kind of go down a rabbit hole actually of video games that have been outright banned in China. Now, I don't mean to kind of stray from the path here. Obviously, I don't know if Nintendo and kind of their not rock solid relationship with China really has anything to do with, having anything in their games that China deems inappropriate to the overall standing of their country or its citizens or anything like that. Obviously, I don't know if that's the case, but I say all of this to say that, yeah, China's very protective of this stuff. So here's the thing. Obviously, I said that with the Switch 1, that came out 2.5 years after its original release in China, and now it turns out with a new report, it kind of sounds like the same thing may be happening with the Switch 2. Now, I obviously don't know if it's going to be, 2.5 years. I don't know if it's going to be 5 years, or maybe it's just going to be 6 months. But right now, it seems that it will not be released in China right away, at least, for that worldwide release on June 5th. I don't think it's going to be coming out at that time in China. Who knows when it will actually come out. So this report comes from a Japanese media company called Nikkei. It looks like the report is actually a lot longer than what I have pictured here, but this is just the preview that I saw without actually paying to bring down the semi-paywall here. So it says Nintendo has decided to postpone the release of its new game console, the Switch 2, in mainland China for the time being. The current Switch was released in China in 2019, but sales have been sluggish due to government regulations that limit the number of games available. The company is expected to wait and see what demand there is. And then it talks about how in China, actually Tencent is responsible for releasing the actual physical Nintendo Switch consoles. So yeah, there's just a ton of censorship in China, and I would assume this probably contributes a fair bit to, these sales being quote-unquote sluggish. In China, you probably don't want to play, on a console that really doesn't have, the full selection of games that you could have on it. I actually remember a while back, about 4 months ago, I talked about this in a video when Nintendo announced that they are closing the eShop in 2026. Now, this is the eShop for the Nintendo Switch 1. Obviously, if and when the Switch 2 were to come out in China, that would probably be its own thing, but there were some comments on that with basically some people, one in particular I remember, where it was a person talking about how they live in China and how it's very common to buy these Nintendo Switch copies that are not the actual China-approved copies, they're from other countries. And that's simply because if you buy the actual China copies, it's just heavy censorship, and you don't get all the games that you want. So yeah, probably not too much of a surprise that these sales are sluggish. Now, Video Games Chronicle actually came came in clutch here and talked a little bit more about this report that was behind the paywall. They talked a little bit more about Tencent. They said that, yeah, in China, the Switch is sold in collaboration with Tencent, the Chinese tech giant that owns dozens of developers and other tech firms. And according to this report from Nikkei, Tencent declined to comment when asked if it would be distributing Switch 2 in China as well. And then it also says that Nikkei's report notes that the release of consoles and software in China must go through inspection by the Chinese authorities with restrictions imposed depending on the Chinese government's intentions. Obviously, that's very consistent with what I was talking about with China's past. So with this report from Nikkei saying the same thing, it sounds like the same kind of stuff is being applied here from China to the upcoming Switch 2. So yeah, it's too bad that China will have, this ongoing censorship even with the Switch 2. I'd have to imagine, though, that the market, maybe you could even call it the black market, for these off-brand Nintendo Switches that are from outside of the sort of China-approved censorship, I wouldn't be surprised to see that this market would be very big for the Switch 2 when it is actually released, especially during the period of time when the Switch 2 is released for the rest of the world, but it is not released in China. I'll definitely keep my eyes open because it would be very interesting to see some reports on how China would maybe handle these black markets that could pop up that are selling the full uncensored Nintendo Switch 2.